Hello, welcome back to Learn Oikonomia. Today we are going to discuss the concept of GDP deflator. Let's get started for the same. Before going into see what is GDP deflator, it is all very important to understand the idea of GDP. So GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. This is what GDP mean with respect to its full form. Now coming to its meaning, it involves the sum total of the final prices of goods and services produced in an economy over a period of time. So this will take into consideration the value of the final goods and services, and this involves the total output with respect to goods and services. And when we say the total output, we consider the case of final output. Now, for the very same reason, it will measure the worth of a nation's economic activities, and that is the main role of GDP here. Having said about GDP, it's time for us to discuss what is deflation. Deflation is something which we call as the opposite of inflation. Inflation, we know that it is a sustained increase in the price level of the economy, but when it comes to deflation, it involves a general fall in the prices. This fall is important. So the commodities price will be going for a sustained fall. This is known as deflation. Although it might appear to be beneficial, it is not considered to be good for the economy when you look for the total effect. So, when we consider deflation, the idea of deflation, this is something which has got a connection to the economic slowdowns. So, for the very same reason, we could see that this will indicate the poor productivity of the economy, and also it lead with job losses, as well as it discusses unemployment scenario, or it involves the unemployment scenario. Now, having discussed the idea of GDP and the idea of deflation, it's time to discuss the concept of GDP deflator. Now, the idea of GDP deflator is taken into consideration as an indicator. So this could be considered as an indicator which would be measuring the inflation in the economy. So this is also known as something called a price deflator, although it is known in the name of an implicit price deflator. As I've told you, this is so because it gives us an indication. It acts as an indicator of the overall inflation that is persisting in the economy over all the or across all the goods and services. And this is done in comparison. So we can go for a comparison here. And with what are we going to compare? You compare the overall inflation, what is prevailing in the base year. So you will be having 2 years, you will be having a current year, and you will be having a base year. So what you do here is that you compare the case of current year with the base year. So the GDP deflator, this would be measuring the average changes that you can see in the prices of all the goods and services that are there in the economy. It doesn't take into consideration the impact of inflation or rising prices when it comes to the rise in GDP or decline in GDP. GDP might be rising or falling. But when it comes to GDP deflator, it doesn't take into consideration the impact of inflation or rising prices when it comes to GDP rising or falling. Moving to the idea of GDP deflator, we could see that this concept or this particular thing would be tackling the the problem that we have discussed now by demonstrating the impact of price changes on GDP. So how this would be done? I told you that we will be having 2 years, we'll be having a base year and also we will be having a current year. And base year will be having some prices and current year will also have some prices. So you will be comparing the base year's prices with the current year's prices, or you will compare the current year's prices with the base year's prices. So always the base year's price would be identified as a base. With respect to the base, what is happening in the current year? With respect to the base year's price, what is the prevailing situation for the current year's price? Is it increasing or falling? This is what we consider. For the very same reason, we could see that the GDP deflator gives us some kind of idea regarding the way in which a change in GDP is influenced by price change. So, for the very same reason, it will be taking a track of the prices paid by the business, government, consumers. Why this is being done? This is being done in order to reflect the magnitude of the price level fluctuations. So, when we say price level fluctuations, it can happen in different manner. It will be usually an increase, an upward movement that you can say with respect to price, which you call as the inflation. Though fluctuation usually involves up and down movements, usually this is what we could see in real life scenario, and for the very same reason, the GDP deflator would be tracking the prices paid by different entities to reflect the magnitude of inflation that is there in the economy. So moving to the formula for calculating GDP deflator, what you could do here is, first of all, you can calculate the nominal GDP, then you can go for the real GDP, then you divide both these. What do you do is that you are dividing the nominal GDP by real GDP, then you multiply that figure with 100, so you will be getting the answer for GDP deflator. Now what is the importance of GDP deflator? Why should you go for the calculation of GDP deflator? So we could see that this is considered to be a very much broader, important indication or indicator that we can have with respect to the economy. So it gives us a broader picture, a wider picture, and a picture painted with multiple colors. And economists always consider GDP deflator as something which could be used to compare the amount of real economic activity that had taken place in a particular year compared to what was there in the base year. So we can go for a comparison of the amount of the real economic activity from one year to the next year. This could be done mainly because we do have 2 years, the base year and the current year. For the very same reason, you compared the case of current year with what is given in the base year. So the base year would be acting as a standard here. As I told you, it will give us a much broader, wider and a multiple perspective picture. It would also compute inflation for your entire economy rather than considering just a basket of goods, like what you do in the case of consumer price index or CPI. The GDP deflator would consider the inflation that is there for the entire economy. It doesn't exclude any industry from this. Also, any shift in the consumption pattern or if there is any structural reforms, all these are taken into consideration when it comes to the idea of GDP deflator. Nothing got eliminated here. And we could see that mostly all people would respond to the changes that is happening with respect to prices, because that will be changing their expenditure pattern. So all these would be captured by the idea of GDP deflator. For the very same reason, the GDP deflator has got a wider, deeper significance when it comes to the idea of economics, and it plays a very important role when it comes to policymakers as well as economists. That doesn't mean that GDP deflator is free from all the criticisms. GDP deflator too has got certain limitations. And what are these limitations? Let's see what are these. When we go to the limitations of GDP deflator, we could see that this is having a limited scope. Why? Because it doesn't provide any specific information regarding the individual commodity. I told you that it just gives an overall picture of the economy. So for the very same reason, there can be very high chances that this would conceal some substantial pricing shift that can happen in some specific industries or in some specific geographical areas. And for the very same reason, GDP deflator is being criticized. Again, regarding quality changes, you can see that GDP deflator does not take into consideration the differences in the product as well as service when it comes to quality. And this can happen over time, right? So this will exaggerate inflation if the product quality improvements could occur without a corresponding increase in the price. For this particular reason also, you criticize the idea of GDP deflator. Also, you can have something called substitution bias when it comes to GDP deflator. And what does it mean by the concept of substitution bias here? So here we could see that the response of consumers to changing prices is not taken into consideration when it comes to GDP deflator. There is something called substitution effect, isn't it? And this is not taken into consideration when it comes to GDP deflator, and that is another important drawback of the same. Also, when it comes to GDP deflator, it excludes some non-market activities. Only those activities which are marketable, only those goods which are marketed would be having a price. What about those commodities which are not entering the market? This is not taken into consideration as far as GDP deflator is concerned. So, for this reason also, it is being criticized for the same. Also, it excludes the international trade effects. Now, we are living in a globalized economy. Whatever produced in our economy is not consumed by our people only. It is being exported to many other nations. Also, we are consuming those products that are produced in different parts of the world. Although changes in import as well as export prices might have some impact on the economy's total price level, this is not taken into consideration when it comes to GDP deflator. Also, you could see that there is something called limited timeliness. GDP deflator is always published after a delay. So, for the very same reason, the figures would not give some accurate picture regarding the economy's price changes. And this is mainly for the delay that is happening with respect to the actual happening and the publication of the very same. Hope you could have some understanding regarding the topic of GDP deflator after watching this video. I request you to like, share and subscribe to this channel for more videos. Also, you can join our free Telegram community for your doubt clearance. I'll be providing the link of that in the description box. Also, you can download the Learn Economy app. For that also, I'll be providing the link in the description box. That's it. Thank you for watching.